Welcome to everyone. I'm Lawrence Kermayer. I direct the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry here at McGill University in Montreal. And this is our Thursday afternoon speaker series. We actually have several series in the same time slot. This is part of an ongoing series called Culture, Mind, and Brain, which is part of our Culture, Mind, and Brain program at McGill, which is sponsored by the Foundation for Psychocultural Research in Los Angeles. And this series also this year, at least, last year and this year, is oriented around a series of talks from contributors to this book, Culture, Mind, and Brain, which came out just toward the end of last year. The book itself is the result of activities of the Foundation for Psychocultural Research, which held a conference by the same name some years ago. And then we invited in various other colleagues and contributors to this field to try to advance a conversation, a very interdisciplinary conversation between people working in social sciences and anthropology, psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy about how to think about the confluence, the intersection, the co-construction, the interpenetration, as we may hear, of these different facets of human experience. And we're hoping that these talks, which are being recorded after a bit of editing and the consent of the speaker, will be available as a supplement to the book for people who are working with it either on their own or in a graduate seminar or some other context. So I'm delighted then to welcome today our guest speaker, Professor Dan Hutto from the University of Wollongong. He is the Senior Professor of Philosophical Psychology and head of the School of Liberal Arts at the University of Wollongong in Australia. And he is a key figure in the development of Inactivism, a philosophical approach that tries to understand mind and human experience as fundamentally engaged in practice, in action, in the social world in some ways. And as you'll hear, is critical of cognitive approaches that try to put all the action inside the heads of people in some kind of mental machinery in some way. And so he, there's a chance both to critically look at some of the really still, I would say, prevalent models and alternatives that may give us a different take on things. And for us, those of us who are concerned with social and cultural psychiatry, this whole critique and this whole perspective is extremely attractive because it gives us a solid way to sort of emphasize the primacy of the social in some ways in human experience. So I've had the privilege to have a bit of an ongoing or intermittent conversation with Dan around these topics, which is always intensely stimulating. And so I'm absolutely delighted to have you here today. And I'll turn the session over to you.
Thank you so much.
One other formatting thing, just to let everybody know. So we'll have about an hour of presentation, and then we'll have about an hour of discussion, I hope. If you have comments or suggestions as we go along, feel free to put them in the chat, but then hopefully we'll all be on this little Hollywood Squares grid and we can talk to each other and you can pose your questions and make your comments. So thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, for having me. And most importantly, actually, thank you for the years of work put into, coordinating the production of the book and the conferences and actually just a whole lot of work in this terrain, which has been really, I think, pushing the field forward. So this is much appreciated. I'm going to now just share my screen and jump right into the presentation. There's a lot there, but hopefully it's not going to be too heavy. There's some technical bits in the middle, not technical in the sense of scientifically technical, but philosophically so, and we'll get moving. So if I can share my screen. Okay, great.
Looks beautiful.
Okay, fantastic. So the first thing I want to just say is, as the title suggests, I'm going to try to give us a sense of what an enculturated picture of mind and brains might look like. I'll do the opening bars of the talk will actually look a bit at some of the work that I've myself done in this domain at a very, very high level. I mean, so we'll be helicoptering up to kind of the big themes and big ideas for the most part. And then I want to bring this into contact with another emerging area of thinking, and particularly I want to cast it against what I will consider an old arch rival of mine, a certain way of thinking about the mind that was very popular when I was growing up as a PhD student, which is the old modular ways of thinking about mind and how I think we've got beyond that. But I also want to suggest that there's some some residual elements of that that are coming out in new ways of thinking about the mind, in terms of particularly the notions of active inference, free energy principle as understood in a certain way, the whole idea that the mind is essentially some form of inference machine. And I want to run some critiques against this and push back against that movement, even though there's been a lot of attempts to ally that movement to the kind of inactivist themes that I'm going to start out by talking about. Okay, so that's what the questioning of the philosophical picture in the subtitle is all about, right? So it's, I think, defending the virtues of this inactivist model, embracing what's good in that other story, but resisting a certain, I think, philosophical picture that gets attached to it that I think could have certain consequences for us. Okay. Now let's just see, why is that? First thing I want to say is that you should go buy Lawrence's book. He put a lot of work into it, and it's an excellent collection. I also just want to forewarn anyone who's come in expecting me to give a précis of the chapter itself. This talk isn't based on the chapter. These are my co-authors who are not to be faulted for anything I happen to say here, although a lot of the themes that I'll be discussing are in the chapter that we produced. In that chapter, we were much more focused on this notion of cultural permeation as a way of understanding how culture permeates mind and thought without the idea that it penetrates cognitive systems. That was the kind of core theme. And again, that was changing the metaphor. So there's a lot of overlap between this, and some of the critiques in the book will take you in a different direction. So I guess that's all the more reason to buy the book, to read the chapter, if you get excited by some of the stuff that's coming out here. So I especially want to thank my co-authors, Sean Gallagher, Ines Hippolyta, and Jesus Ilhandran for their help in getting that chapter finished. Okay. So if you hadn't heard this, there's been a sort of E-turn. There's a proliferation of E's. That's not a drug that you get at your local rave. It's the new way of thinking about the mind that has been taking hold. And there's endless different E's that we might be interested: ecological, extended, extensive, embodied, inactive, and such like. I'm going to focus on a certain brand of E, which I call radical inactivism. I still think, some of my fellow inactivists say it's not really inactivist enough, and others, this is the life of a philosopher. But others think it's too inactive in the sense that it's too resistant to certain intellectual pictures of the mind that they want to retain, and we'll see why in a moment. So there's an interesting ongoing discussion. In particular, if I had more time, I would say that I think one of the ambitions for anyone working in this area would be to try to find a more unified account of what it is to have these approaches, because really they proliferate and they don't always sit well together in terms of some of the things that are said. So that would be another project, but I won't be getting into that today. I just want to give you some of the big reminders of the nature of these kind of programs. If you might think that we've come quite a long way in our thinking about the mind, at least if we looked at some of the most prominent offerings from this we'll call it E tradition, or within this E family. Whereas in the old days, it was almost universally assumed by everybody that minds are rooted in representation and computation, that's the core properties that they had, however we were to understand them. And that often in those days, the idea was that the representations had to have contentful properties as well, that in some way or another described the world or made reference to it in those kind of terms. What we've seen over time is a move, as you can see, this circle, which I just found on the internet, this slow shift, at least, to thinking more and more about the mind in terms of dynamic and emergent, embodied and embedded notions of life and living, as opposed to in terms of modeling and using metaphors that are derived from mechanisms such as computers. Now, the first thing to note, and if you look at this way of drawing it, it suggests a kind of progression from the 70s right up to wherever today was, whenever they drew that, where it's a very neat and simplistic picture that suggests that this is almost like one vision superseded the other, where of course that's not the case. There are plenty of people who are still completely wedded to the computational representational stories, and that's part of what makes this an interesting time to work in the domain of the cognitive science, is trying to balance out how much, if any, from each of these different pictures we want to retain, or how they might relate to each other, is another huge project. Okay. But if we were to really take the essence or the core properties of the E approaches, and certainly the inactivist approaches that I want to endorse, the really bottom line idea is that we should be looking to not computers or mechanisms to understand the nature of cognition and mind, but to living systems, wherever we find them, and however lowly they may be, that those will give us some indication of the core properties of what it is to be minded. Indeed, this is the theme that comes up quite a lot in the descriptions of the core ideas. So Evan Thompson, for example, tells you that my mind is lifelike and life is mind-like, that they both share some core set of properties that could be put in a more metaphysical or a more epistemological mode. So we might say, along with Noé, which has more of the epistemological flavor, where we discern life, we have everything we need to discern mind. So, you know, if we're using the models that we want to use to understand as a framework, full understanding of mind, we're going to perhaps just need to look at living systems again, right? So there's different ways that you could construe that. I'm not going to get into that difference here. What I'm going to say is that, you know, if you go back to, I'm really glad they updated the cover on this, because it was a hard sell in the original version, but they've made this much more E-friendly, I think, in its looks. But the Embodied Mind came out in 1991, quite a long time ago. And here I was just floating up just a few back in, this slide was produced in 2017, when we had, you know, 3 new books emerge just in that year. That really take the radical position of the sort that I'm going to be pushing. And I believe the radical position on the nature of the inactive mind is very much embedded in the embodied mind. If there's a core theme in the embodied mind with Evan, Varela, Thompson, and Roche's book, it's that their inactivism was meant to be an antidote to a certain representationalist ways of thinking about the mind. And that theme there's really a vast wing of activity with a number of authors who really embrace that theme very, very full on. So that's, I just want it as a reminder. If I was to sort of fill up the page, it would take a long time to fill up all the publications have come out subsequent to 2017 even, and before that, who really embrace this, what I'll call technically an anti-representationalist variant of inactivism. Okay. And so that's really where I've been perhaps working hardest, along with Eric Meehan. He and I have been pushing for some time, not just developing the positive aspects. In fact, probably we're most known for not doing that. And maybe I'm just always known for being a bit negative, but we spent most of our time trying to produce the arguments that would justify going in this direction, or to put pressure on anyone who wants to make free and easy use of the notion of a representation, to actually define what notion that is and explain how we can legitimately do this within the sciences of the mind. So we're known for putting forward a position which in a 3-letter acronym, we capture with the notion of radically inactive cognition, or radically inactive embodied cognition. And it argues that cognition is not all of a piece. It's not uniform. This is very important in what's coming. Cognition isn't always and everywhere, and certainly not at its roots, and this is the most important part of the theme, representational or content involving. Now, one aspect of this that people sometimes get wrong is we're not saying that no cognition is contentful or content involving. Plenty of it, I think, is. It's just that that's not the signature feature of all forms of cognition. And cognition doesn't start out as essentially content involving. That's an achievement of some cognitive systems if they're put in certain circumstances and they have the mastery of the right sorts of practices. Now, this theme is going to be a big one. So if I was just drawing it in the biggest way in what's coming, it's going to be that certain sorts of practices mold and shape and bring into being certain forms of cognition like that. And so the question about what the root form of cognition is really where the centerpiece of this particular talk is going to go, because there's a counterclaim about what we can say about all forms of cognition that I want to question and resist. Okay, so that's the idea. I won't take you all through it, but the big idea of the book, if you want to summarize it in just a sentence or two, would be to say that we drove the main argument of this was to, in a quippy way, make a comparison with Dave Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, which everyone is aware of, I hope, which sets philosophers and cognitive scientists' teeth going so much so that they wanted to avoid the topic of consciousness for many years because it was just too difficult to incorporate into their serious scientific thinking. Dave Chalmers, when he introduced it, was always saying, well, there's a psychological notion of cognition that doesn't suffer, right? And that's the representational computational stuff. It doesn't have the same problems that consciousness does. They don't have those problems, whereas consciousness did. And we called that out and said, no, actually, there's at the roots of this, there's equally hard problems of understanding content, such that, for example, when we talk about information, and I'll come back to this later, we talk about informational content, we're confusing different things. The scientifically respectable notion of information that we do have that's used in many fields doesn't entail the existence of content. In fact, doesn't enable us to explain how there could be such a thing as content. What you talk about there is something like mere covariance. And mere covariance isn't any kind of content, is one of the themes of the book. And insofar as it isn't, we're owed an explanation if one wants to leverage the notion of information to get something like notions like aboutness or content for free, right? Those things don't come for free. That's part of the problem. There have been many attempts to advance upon those notions and give better accounts, and I deal with those in the book. And some of the very best ones, I think, still fall short of giving a proper naturalistic account of content in these terms. So that's a longer discussion, but I'm just giving you what I think is the overarching line of argument that's produced in these books. And then the thought would be, well, look, in the positive story, well, how then do you deal with explaining really seemingly very contentful aspects of mind? This is just one. I mean, I was actually speaking by Zoom in Berkeley earlier this week about mathematical cognition. So the standard objection to these kinds of approaches is there's going to be a whole bunch of things like mathematical cognition, theory of mind, imagination, memory, all of which we've worked on intensively. And people will say, look, if you don't allow for there to be representational content, these seem to be representational phenomena through and through. So how do you account for the emergence of these kinds of forms of cognition in the natural world if you don't allow that there to be content at the basis of all cognition? And the answer is you have to come up with more inventive stories, and stories is exactly where I go. So instead of thinking that we inherit a mechanism, which is a theory of mind device, that already has all the properties, a set of theories and laws and contents that enables us to understand other minds, I want to push that back and look at what in the environment of a system would have enabled them to get in a position to think like that mirrors structurally what you might call having a theory of mind, which makes that an attractive position, but which I think gets wrong the account of what is the real basis, what's the real cognitive basis for understanding others. Okay, so the language around theory of mind, we have that, or talked about mind reading, or people talk sometimes more softly about folk psychology. That's all supposed to capture something like simply our everyday way of understanding people, where that's thought to involve something like having felicity with a range of mental attitudes, beliefs, desires, hopes in a very systematic structure, such that though we are competent in ascribing those attitudes, and we're sensitive to the way that those attitudes can interrelate in complex ways. And we know when we've got legal and illegal uses of that, combinations, like sometimes we can't make sense of another person because what they're saying doesn't go together. So that looks like a structured activity, and that very naturally lends itself to the idea that that's a form of theorizing. And that is the thought that I've been resisting like for a very long time, right? So I don't want to subsume our everyday way of understanding others into a form of theoretical inference. The big idea, the counter idea with the narrative practice hypothesis has been, look, it's engaging in socially supported storytelling activities. That's the normal route for developing anything that might be called, what I prefer to call, a folk psychological competence, our way of understanding ourselves and others, in terms of acting for reasons, right? Where we cite or make attributions with respect to certain types of mental states. So the idea there was it's engaging with a very special kind of narrative, which I call the folk psychological narrative, that equips us to understand our reasons for acting. Why special? Well, they're the kinds of narratives that put on show these kind of mental state properties. And they give exemplars of what it is to make explanation over and over again until you begin to pick this up, and you begin to pick this up as you might pick up any other kind of skill. So I very much like Victoria McGear's way of putting it. This is a kind of enculturated know-how. It's not based in a kind of set of propositions or know that, and it's certainly not embedded in an inherited, biologically inherited theory of mind that we received as a gift or a bequest, from our hominid ancestors. That's exactly what this position resists. But it also resists, and I think this will be a foreshadowing, it resists the idea that this is primarily a theoretical business. One of the nice things about the account, I think, is it says, look, most of our encounters don't involve having to make inferences about other people's minds because other people just tell you what they think. You ask them and they tell you. You don't have to guess at what they're thinking. So it also puts center stage different functions about how narratives work in our lives. Whereas the other one, we're the lonely pup in the Christmas shop because we're always estranged from each other, so that we're always having to fundamentally guess at the contents of other minds and make inferences. That's not to say that we might not use inferences within that process, but that's not to be the primary work, is not to make those inferences, right? So somebody's explaining something to me, I may think, wow, I might have certain expectations about what they're going to say next based on what they've said, but that's not that I have to use inferences in order to get at all of the information or all the details of their mindset. Okay. So the big thought here was that these kind of capacities are not in really important ways different from the other kind of structures that kind of feed back to animals. It picks up on the social niche construction idea that we have cognitive niches. So many animals create external structures that shape their environments. Spiders fashion webs, beavers build dams, and those creations in turn influence and shape the animals that create them and can influence their cognitive properties. This is a theme that's been picked up quite a lot with the idea of carpentered environments that make a difference to our cognition. And you can see how that would work. The more narrative practices, the more narratives there are around, and the more we engage in them through our practices, the more that's going to shape the way that we tend to think and drive it in certain directions and enhance them. So here's a quote that I really like from that comes from a paper by Maxwell Ramsed and other authors. It says, in human life, the regularities to which agents are sensitive and are densely mediated and often constituted by cultural symbol, narratives, and metaphors. These shape social experience and in turn are shaped by broader social context. So the feedback loops story explains how these kind of capacities, once they begin to emerge, can take root, take hold. So you don't have to explain them in terms of something that pre-existed with all those properties in terms of, say, a theory of mind device. So it's very inactive friendly. The idea is that organisms create artifacts in their environment, they engage with them, same as the spider in their web. We do this with narratives, and the narratives provide feedback loops and bring new ways of thinking, which then fuel more engagement and more change cognitively. And then what you get is lots and lots of different varieties. So you get variation across different cultures about the nature of the narratives that people use. And thereby, you come to form different ways of understanding others that have subtle differences, different norms, different practices, right? Okay, so that's the the core idea. So now I just want to say a word about the old arch rival. I'll be very, very quick about this because this is just a foreshadowing of what's to come. So the old arch rival was the idea that you inherited, sort of like that red bit in the center of that head, a kind of a specialized mechanism or device that contained the core rules of folk psychology, and the, detailed on the theory version of this, which is the only one I'll focus on here. We could have a lot of discussions about all the theoretical options in this space, but the standard one that I'll talk about here is one version of theory, the modular theory of mind, assumed that, at least in its early popular variants, that we have a specialized domain-specific device that just functions to tell us how minds work, and that this is what we bring to bear when we understand others. Moreover, it assumed that that is something that was forged back in the environment of evolutionary adaptation on the standard versions, right? So the idea was that this is something not that is installed through our narrative practices as such, but provides, it predates them, right? So the idea, very popular at the time, was theory of mind modules must have been present in Homo sapiens 100 to 150,000 years ago. And the reason being is that pretty much it's assumed that it's universal in the species. And because of that, they thought, well, if it is, it has to be installed prior to our expansion around the globe. And these arguments were just running on the assumption that everyone has this capacity to do theory of mind, and pretty much they do it all in the same way, essentially, right? Whatever outward parameterized differences we find, at the root, there's going to be one way of actually understanding other minds. And that one way of understanding other minds looks an awful lot like the way that we do it in our particular Western industrialized cultures, right? So that model became the model for how we understand others around the globe. So this is one of the few pieces of correspondences I had with Jerry Fodor before he passed away. I love Jerry. I invited him to come to a conference, and he just wrote back to say why he didn't want to. And that just tells me the part of the reason was, I said, well, I was hoping you come and could refute my theory that, disagrees with yours. He goes, oh, I can do that over the email. So he just sent that nice refutation. He says, I can't imagine it takes much practice in storytelling to acquire capacity of folk psychology. Well, why not? Well, as far as I was able to tell from a very unsystematic look at the literature, the practice is absolutely universal. So the basis, and Jerry's got it right, if the idea is it's rooted in the theory of mind capacities that we inherit from our hominid ancestors, the practices is not even just the icing on the cake, it's just peripheria, right? It's just not what's happening. The essence is inherited, the capacity is defined in the way he's defined it, and it always has the same features wherever you look across the globe. Now, if you take that up, it turns out we invert the standard story that I was giving earlier, right? All of our literary capacities, all of these reduced to and can be explained in terms of these theory of mind mechanisms. And that view is very rife in the literature, right? So why we read fiction, a theory of mind in the novel, right? Theory of mind in literature, where the idea is that these capacities to engage in literature are rooted in a universal capacity that we've inherited for theorizing. So narrative becomes, attached to that. So Tom, it even has a logo now, I think. At least I found this on the web. Well, for some time, a number of philosophers have been wondering, well, is it really true that there is no really interesting, and I will stress the point, interesting variation in the way that people understand each other around the globe? Like, are they all using the same universal capacities in the same mode? And some time ago, there was a paper that raised this question and asked, ideally, the requirement is just strongly supported comprehensive studies of folk psychologies, which display widespread major differences between the concepts of those of folk psychologies and those of Western folk psychology. And the question was asked a long while ago, do such studies exist? Now, I have to say, I've been on lookout for these for a long time. There's some work in this area, but it's still very, very patchy. And there is some work that's shown that people don't always have the same ways of understanding each other in every culture, or even culture's too big a word, because what you'll find is, pattern practices that emerge within different parts of different societies and populations. If you look at some of this, it's impressive. Even if you use standard false belief tests, people began to find early on, this is the kind of standard model that at least you can get a methodological comparison point. They really found vast differences in the ages at which people engaged in certain styles of understanding others, including like the false belief tasks here. Really, really big differences in terms of competence in using these tests at really very different times if you compared people of different ages and different populations. They've found that the way that the order of these things at least show up, whether belief understanding precedes that of desire or that of knowledge, this changes in different cultures. And the more exciting thesis that I think has yet to be really fully examined is that really we're not going to find even the same notions. They don't track onto anything like a core set of competencies. So if you look at different cultures, you get something that just gets lost in translation if you try to take that concept and map it onto one that we're used to. So, you might find that the explanations of anger and rage are mixed, anger and emotion are mixed together, anger and pride. In some cultures, if we look at different ways of understanding emotion, we find that we can't always easily find a cognate comparator within the Western set of folk psychological notions, belief, desires, etc. We don't find the same set of concepts. Now, you could explain this phenomenon away, but it does put pressure on the idea that there's an absolute universal, basic architectural way of thinking about minds in terms of belief, desire psychology, for example, which is the usual move. But we find therefore in other cultures that they don't have anything that maps onto this in any direct way at all. So I won't stall over this. I'm going to take that as read. I think more work would have to be done to fully push this, but that's the direction in which the narrative practice hypothesis has expectations. It expects to find differences, whereas the opponent arch rival expects to find similarities, right? And insofar as it does, it has to explain them away. And we know the standard tools for doing so. I'm not going to make an argument about is that a knockdown argument against such positions. What I'm saying is that these two frameworks have very different expectations about how we should understand this phenomena. Okay. So I'm going to leave that there. That's the arch old rival. And now with that as a kind of setup, I want to look at the new boss, right? So we've got, I would say that over the years, we've done a fairly good job of putting a great deal of pressure on that traditional modular thinking. And a lot of people have moved away from it. So there's not so many, there are still some proponents of it, but it's not as aggressively supportive as it used to be, or taken as a default option in the field. But this, I think, is the new boss, and I do think this is has some similarities. So this is a cautionary tale with the position that I just described. So that's why I set that up in that way. And the new boss is really something like some various names: predictive processing theory, the idea that the brain is an inference machine, the idea that sometimes connected with some interpretations of free energy principle, but it is the core idea that the basic thing that we're really engaged in when we're being cognitively active is some form of inference to the best explanation, some form of active inference about the nature of things. So you get this comment, and it's pretty clearly laid out by Andy Clark here. I'll come back to this point through a set of metaphors. He, in describing one experiment, he says the experimenter here is a scientific experiment, is roughly in roughly the position of the biological brain itself. Her task, made possible by powerful mathematical and statistical tools, is to take patterns of neural activation and on that basis infer properties about the stimulus. And that's the idea about his claim here, is that's pretty much what the business of the brain is. It's always trying to get at causes that are beyond it by using what a slim evidential pickings it's got in front of it to make inferences, and it gets better and better at that through iterated processes and multiple hierarchical activity that kind of integrates and improves those hypotheses over time. Okay. Or here again, we have Jacob Howie. The problem of causal inference for the brain is analogous in many respects to our everyday reasoning about cause and effect, and to the scientific methods of causal inference. So the brain, again, whereas we used to have with theory, when we try to understand others, we're really engaged in a scientific effort to get at the hidden causes of their actions. And so we make inferences about other minds. And that was the model that the narrative practice hypothesis was meant to resist. So now we have another universal story that tells us, look, all cognition, not just that of understanding other minds, but all forms of cognition, right down to perception, action, all the way up and all the way down, is a matter of doing something similar. It's making theoretical inferences to get at a best explanation. And the core of that, as we just saw with the Howie quote, is that we have an inverse problem. We're trying to get at things. We're trying to get at things we don't have direct access to. We're trying to get at these causes that we don't really understand. It's very important to realize that this whole thing is set up in a very epistemological mode once you set it up in this way. So there have to be contentful inferences about these external causes that you're trying to test your theorizing about. That way of setting things up, when you make that analogy that we just talked about, already makes the brain very much a epistemic, rather than simply an engaging organ. It's epistemically driven and it's epistemically characterized. I'll come back to this. Okay. Now, I think the big question that looms here is, how seriously should we take this rough analogy that we just heard? How seriously, and in which respects, to use Howie's quote, should we take it seriously, if any, right? So how much do we have to buy in and how much do we not? If you read the literature, and I'll just gloss over this here, usually the idea is we don't expect the brain to be making explicit inferences. People talk about implicit inferences as if that was easy to make a distinction between, but I guess the idea is the inference doesn't have to be consciously aware. No one's making any claims of that nature. And indeed, that is another thing that people literally say in the field. So it's not, you're not consciously aware of it. It's somehow going on without. That's fine. My question is, or so it seems, is this is going to commit us to a very particular vision of the mind that will be at odds with the inactivism that I described, if it turns out that the inferences are thought to be contentful, right? If the brain is tracking in contentful inferences the way that we ordinarily do, and that aspect is not modulated, then it's going to be at odds with the position that I had argued for on principled grounds, right? I had argued that there are problems with the standard stories about how we get content. That's going to be an incompatibility if the story says, well, in taking this very seriously, we're also committed to the idea that brains are making contentful inferences at some level about the state of things. And that, at least on some versions, seems to be implied by Howie's inference to the best explanation aimed at truth characterization. Okay. Now, notice there's some wiggle room about how you capture, this debate in the field. You can be committed to that idea and yet differ on other issues. Now, Howie thinks that the predictive processing story paints a picture of the brain as a secluded inference machine, right? And he thinks it kind of revives certain Cartesian metaphysical concerns. So he thinks that it embeds in its whole picture a stark mind-world schism, right? Andy Clark, however, says, no, that's not quite right. The predictive processing story can allow for an open conduit to the world, and thus serving as a perfect partner for e-accounts to cognition of the kind I was talking about. So I depict him here, not to give Howie kind of too much of a slight, but the picture is a bit more in your own coffin of your brain, Nosferatu style picture versus Andy Clark's Silver Surfer, surfing uncertainty into the world model. Now here's the linchpin of the paper. It's been argued recently that, or proposed recently, that we can find peace between the inactivist stories that I've been trying to promote and these representational stories. Actually, back in 2015, Andy Clark put forward a paper offering us peace in our time. Predicting Peace was the title, and the end to the representation wars, right? But I want you to take note of what I'll call the deal on offer, or the way he intended to broker this piece. The idea was, it was not to concede anything about the representational character of the mind, but just to observe that the representations could be highly dynamical and action oriented in their structure. Well, that seems like not enough to get the in-principled enactivist who has concerns about our ability to give an explanation in terms of these mental state contents or representations, enough reason to come over and break bread. Predictive processing, as he puts it, only involves representations that are action oriented through and through. So the idea was, I guess, that if they conceded that these weren't static representations, that somehow one would be persuaded to think that this was enough to capture, to overcome the real issues. So Andy, in another place, in fact, you can see I've highlighted the bits in red that I think are problematic versus all the other bits, which I think are perfectly fine in green. Andy says, instead of simply describing how the world is, these models, even when considered at those higher, more abstract levels, are geared to engaging those aspects of the world that matter to us. They're delivering a grip on the patterns that matter for the interactions that matter. I love the bit in green. I think that's exactly the core theme of the Inactivist story. The question is, the big money question here is, are these states describing anything at all? Because that's the bit that was the problem. We don't have an account of how they could be describing or have contentful thoughts about the world. So here's Andy from a picture in Memphis when he was trying to sell this. I think this is an instance where Andy's trying to have his cake and eat it too. For me, the cake behind Andy, when he was actually using this to illustrate the multi-leveled nature of the process, but for me, it's an absolutely disgusting looking cake that I don't want to eat. And if you look at his shirt, it looks as if he's had a bad accident with it already. So it's my line on this is, I don't want this compromise peace offering if it comes in the shape of a cake of that nature. I feel a bit like, this is a peace offering that, not to villainize my opponents, but just this is a kind of peace offering that, like Chamberlain, brought back in World War II, we might wish to resist taking up too quickly. We would have to concede too much to that position. That's problematic. It's interesting that in 2020, another paper has emerged with the same theme, enacting an armistice through active inference. And you can see the issue down here below one more time. This just came out, or at least I just found this paper. And here it offers, quote, a mathematically informed reading of generative models that could accommodate both richly representationalist and dynamicist views of cognition. But the problem for the inactivists who took a principled stand on this was they don't think that these are richly representationalist. So the peace offering here is a kind of bizarre compromise. It's like the Westphalia, they actually in the paper describe the this new armistice as something like developing the Treaty of Westphalia that put an end to the 30 Years' War and overcame all the problems related to the Holy Roman Empire. This is their own analogy. But the Treaty of Westphalia was a turning point because it developed Europe's ability to live with religious diversity. The story here is not a compromise of that kind. What it's saying is you're going to embed representations into all cognition, which is exactly what the inactivists were resisting on principled grounds. So that seems more like embedding the Holy Roman Church into everything that we do, rather than coming to a compromise that we could possibly live with. So that compromise was supposed to lead to the sovereignty of states, which kept the peace by maintaining a balance of power. That's also not going to be a good model for what's going on. We want a singular picture of cognition. We don't just want different camps coming to some kind of agreement not to, fight over this. So these political analogies don't really work. And I think it's not unimportant to take stock of what people have in mind when they think they're finding a kind of a way of unifying these accounts. I feel a bit like this proposal has a Cybermanish feel to it. I feel like, it's all going to work out well if we convert in fundamental ways to the representationalist picture, rather than have a model that we can live in freedom and peace. So really the point I want to underscore here is this. The reason I'm wary of the whole program is I think we should be wary of modeling the most basic activity of the brain or mind on features of a mindset that emerged only with late developing scientific practices. That is, inference to the best explanation, scientific methodology. Those for me emerged on the story that I would tell very late in the day. They're not the basis of all cognition. There are some structural similarities between basic cognition and those things. That's because there's some structural similarities between everything and everything, right? It's not totally accidental that we went in a certain direction, but I don't think the mere function of brain is to behave as a scientist with respect to its environment. There are other ways of conceiving of how it engages with that environment. And that's the worry, that this is the counter proposal to the inactivist proposal, to treat that mindset as if it captures the essence of all cognition, right? And that is the move here. So on that model, all cognition, even in its most fundamental forms, is, according to this framework, thought to have the shape of advanced logico-scientific theorizing and thinking. That's a pretty, it's always cast in terms of an integrative or unified account, but that's pretty, if you like, an imperialist ambition. Now, it's not to say that the inactivists don't have a similar take, but it's not trying to impose a picture of one sort of practice on as the signature way of thinking about all forms of cognition. It's allowing for a lot more diversity to emerge in its account. So I think that's very important. And so and this is what I want to gesture, people are now beginning to they've tried to subsume every form of cognitive phenomena under this umbrella. But even now, et tu narrative, it seems, is a pertinent situation. I'll just read a few quotes from a paper I looked at recently, and you can see the point that I'm making, I think, through this example. Quote, "The functions of narrative can be understood in terms of the principles of active inference." You would have thought that narrative was quite unlike theorizing if the earlier part of my paper had any kind of grip. But on this story, this is where it comes into it. We argue that narratives function as enactive inferential models. Well, that's exactly what I was resisting all these years with respect to theory of mind. I don't think, and not just me, of course, Sean Gallagher, Dan Zahavi, a bunch of phenomenologists, saying, look, it's not, if we use that model to characterize our social interactions, we're going to misunderstand fundamental aspects of them. Even the importance and ubiquity of narratives can be parsimoniously explained by appealing to their role in active inference. So the importance of our narrative ways of thinking become important only because they're serving this larger engine of getting at a more accurate representation of the world. That seems to underscore, at least, or miss what I think to be many other important functions that they play that have nothing to do with this, at the very least. Or again, quote, "Having a narrative furnishes inference with a simple and efficient way to account for the sensory evidence at hand. On that view, narratives provide hypotheses that enable inference to the best prediction." Okay. This comes from an unpublished paper, as you can see, so I'm not trying to overplay this, but I do think it wouldn't, I could almost predict that this paper will come up, right? Has to come up if you're going to insert narratives in some way into the machinery of that model. If that ambition is to get everything into one format, we're going to find that everything has to be in the service of inference to the best explanation in some way. Just have a look at how I'm doing for time, Lawrence. Probably running out of it. So,
got it. I mean, you can take another 10 minutes or so. I mean, just, make sure you get a nice rounded and, launch the argument that you want.
Well, I think what I'm going to have to do is skip the huge swathe of material and jump to a finale. And the material I can take back in the questions, because it's, I'll just dance over the next set of slides very, very, very fast, because I think there's too much to go through.
I mean, take 15 minutes if you need, Dan. It's important that you lay this out. So yeah.
Okay, I'll skip through some bits. The stuff that I'm about to say, I'll do it more in a more general fashion, and people can pick me up in questions, right? So we can come back to it. First thing I just wanted to note was, that picture that we just saw is really, if you go back to the work by Jerome Bruner, who was a real inspiration to me, it's a completely goes against his whole way of thinking that what really makes narratives interesting is that they really differ from theoretical, logical, scientific thinking, right? They're essentially not the same in the ways that they are. So this is a reductive project. We're going to explain narratives in terms of something that they're not, and their core features are then going to be understood quite differently than what we expected. So look, none of that says that the other position is false. I'm not saying that here. I have plenty of arguments against it. That's different. What I'm saying is, let's understand the consequences of taking it up, right? For the moment, that will be good enough. And I think they're important. The next bit I was going to do would have rehearsed the hard problems. Now I'm going to skip through this because there's no way I'll do that in 15 minutes. It's a lot, it gets technical. I'm going to try to get you to the punchline points. So if people will need to ask me questions about this, I'm quite happy to take them up. But the bottom line is the function of this section. So this is the more important issue for my listeners, is what's going to move from just describing these differences, which I hope to have made clear by now, to motivating a resistance to that model through a rehearsal of some of the problems. And in fact, it was focused particularly on claims made by predictive processing aficionados, and to show why they don't escape the hard problems that I had raised in my work some time ago. So I'm going to bounce us through that. I'm not going to take us through all the micro detail what's going to come up in these slides, because it will just take too long, and I'd rather have some more questions than take you through those details. But I'll skim over this, and then I'll bring to a final section what I think could be important for clinical consequences that we should probably take stock of. Okay. Really, I mean, even Andy raised the question of how if we take this epistemic take on predictive processing, where does the knowledge that powers the predictions actually come from in the first place? And I think that's a really great philosophical question. It needs to be answered if we're going to, apart from having a tool, we're going to have a philosophically satisfactory framework, right? We need to know that we can complete this explanation. The proposals, I'll just jump through this, is largely that it's, as he put it, there's a bootstrapping process that comes up through you engage with the world and you build up your evidential base and you produce better models and you go through that process, and it eventually generates these, you start from that modest beginnings and you get to something quite rich and powerful in terms of predictions. Okay. I'll just jump through this. He describes it, the image captures it, a kind of bootstrapping heaven, right? You kind of move to your heavenly state because you've engaged appropriately with a world-friendly signal that helps you on your way. And I'll just put it this, I'm not going to read the quote for reasons of time, but basically Howie gives the same answer, and that's just broadly the same answer that people want to give, that it's through those engagements, improving inferences through engagement, that we build up that knowledge base. But here's the fly in the ointment. The question that Andy asked in the first place was better, and this answer didn't seem to address it. It said, look, if you start with some modest inferences through engagement, the content of your inferences get better. The question was, how did you get in a position to make inferences in the first place, was the question. And that answer didn't tell us the answer to it. And my skepticism is, why think that the brain is making inferences in the first place at all? And what is it making inferences about? And how do you explain its ability to make inferences about anything, right? That's the hard problem, right? That wasn't answered by a bootstrapping story that assumed it was making some modest inferences. So that assumes that you've got a little bit of fire, you get more fire. My question was, how did we get fire in the first place? That was the formulation that Andy gave initially. And here it becomes really important that, what happens a lot is external observers, this is a number of authors have pointed out, we talk about the codes that the brain uses, but really they're codes for the external observers who are already in the know about what the brain's engaging with, right? So from the outside, we interpret the brain as representing information of such and such kind because we're aware of what it's doing, right? the assumption is you just read that back into the brain. And a number of people have been highlighting this in a number of different contexts about the methodology of just assuming that the brain has a kind of position. So information in neuroscience is often measured with an implicit experimenter's receiver assumption, rather than thinking of in terms of the cortex as the receiver. And then you have to say, well, what is it that the cortex receives? What does it know in its basal state? What I would like about this point that I'm making is that it's something that the bootstrappers, fans of the bootstrap solution, are alive to. So Andy says, we mustn't conflate the quote perspective of an external observer of some system with that of the animal system itself. So that seems to me entirely correct, right? So then you ask, well, what evidence does it have in and of itself? Well, Andy gives a very nice answer here. He says, look, all that it knows about in any direct sense are the ways that its own states flow and alter. Like that's where it starts, apparently. The brain must optimize its inferences about the world, starting only with, quote, the slim pickings of the sensory evidence. Now, here's a thing I'm going to pick up on. It's already assumed at the base of this story that it's got evidence for something, because that's supposedly the function that's being assumed. But that's what I'm questioning, whether we can help ourselves to the idea that it's in an evidential relationship, and whether it has enough content to be able to have thoughts about anything at all, or whether we are allowed to help ourselves to that without explanation. Clark stresses that the task of generating optimal inferences about hidden causes, starting from minimal sensory evidence, is, quote, a formidable task, but in essence, that's the task of the biological brain, and that's where the bootstrapping story kicks in, right? You start out with really, really thin evidence, and then you're kind of in a Quinian scenario, and then you just keep having a go until your theories get better and better over time. If you consider this how a scientist does things, we might start out with just correlations in the world that don't already have content. We just look at things we already have a background knowledge of, and then the correlations provide a basis for making certain kinds of inferences. So rock formation from which some piece of geological history can be inferred, we can imagine. We can imagine a stratified formation with a layer of coal sits above a layer of limestone. And then what happens here is that the geologist uses known correlations, such as how limestone relates to certain deposits, to infer the deposit of an ancient sea, or the fact that the coal stratum sits above the limestone. So that relation itself enables them to infer that the sea came before the forest, but only if they have concepts of seas, forest, a whole lot of theorizing, a whole lot of background. Otherwise, those correspondences aren't kind of things that they're going to make those epistemic judgments about. And notice in the story I just gave, the information there is just the correlations themselves. So knowledge of the correlations comes from the geologist who has the background theory and concepts in order to make sense of them in a certain way. So the devilish challenge, the really hard part, is to say, when Alex Rosenberg, for example, says, whatever the brain does, it doesn't operate on states that contain sentences on or about things, facts and events outside the mind, right? If you've done that, you've already given the brain all its cognitive powers without actually explaining how it got them. You haven't answered the hard problem, right? So that's just setting it up. So that's, I think, quite a devilish, that's the really hard thing to get a grip on, not the how did you get from slender evidence to more robust evidence? Slender evidence to more robust theorizing. How did we go from how do we explain why there's evidence there in the first place? Clark himself tellingly says the term information here is used simply as a description of energy transfer. Talk of information must ultimately be cashed out in terms of energies impinging on the sensory perceptor. So information can't already be presumed to be contentful or about something or have any of those properties that Rosenberg just raised as issues. Informational talk, he says, thus makes no assumption concerning what the information is about. But here's the real bottom line to capture the worry. Without an answer to the devilish challenge of where brains get the background contents for representing information, we're actually only entitled to a weaker starting point than the one that Clark just gave. And this is the nuts and bolts worry. Information talk, thus used, I would say the better way of putting it, can make no assumption that information is about anything. that is the formulation for the hard problem, not the formulation that, we don't know what the information is about. That's an epistemic worry. We assume that we have an answer to the idea that information comes prepackaged as being about something, but we don't have an existing theory that tells us that. We have a story through the sciences that says information is correlational, not one that tells us how it's about something. And that's been the evasive problem in the philosophy of mind, at least for the longest time. So I think this isn't a bootstrap heaven story, but I call it a bootstrap hell story, right? Once you really look into the details, we're not any further along. In fact, we're back where we were all along, with the same set of philosophical worries about how this story is supposed to be finished up. Now, that's okay. Somebody can say, well, the answer may come in due course of time. That doesn't defeat the theory's values and virtues in other respects, but it does raise a philosophical concern about whether we should jump on it. The way that Rosenberg sums this up, the brain has no more original intentionality than anything else does, is the hardest illusion to give up, right? Which is just assuming that because they're brains that they have more intentionality than they do. So I had three big options here. I just want to sketch these. One is you take the brain scientist analogy very seriously and either give it or promise a straight answer to the devilish challenge. You can do that. But you have to do that, it seems to me, if you're going to take it very, very seriously. Two, don't take the brain analogy too seriously. Go mental fictionalist, mild realist. There's a whole lot of options for, not committing too heavy to this, whilst, saying, look, I'm using the metaphor. Or my preferred route is don't take the brain scientist analogy seriously. Go with a non-representationalist account, an activist account about basic minds. Don't assume that basic minds already have the properties that would be needed for us to do scientific theorizing and inference of that kind, at least not in anything like a contentful mode. So I think that if we really want philosophical peace, I'm much more persuaded of Wittgenstein's line on this. We put away the problems that drive us crazy by questioning the philosophical pictures that bring those problems into being. There is scope for understanding this modeling talk that doesn't leave us in that quandary. Some of what Tristan says sometimes about models and about agents doesn't put us there. I think this is my favorite quote that I've ever found. An agent, quote, doesn't have a model of its world. It is a model, but it's a model for somebody else, just like the brain can be for the scientist, right? We don't assume that it's modeling, per se, contentfully the world. We say that its engagements with the world give us a way of talking that doesn't mean that we have to take it very seriously, that its basis of its cognition is rooted in making inferences to the best explanation. But its attunements to the world can be well picked up in those terms. And that would be my preferred way of thinking about this. So here, it's really nice that Tristan expands on this to say, we must understand model in the most inclusive sense is combining interpretive dispositions, morphology, neural architecture, applying a highly tuned fit between the active embodied arrangements of things, embodied organism and the embedded environment, right? This, I think, if you give me this account of how we could make peace between the positions, I think it's acceptable. The other one, not so. So Andy actually asked this question at one point: why not simply ditch the talk of inner models and internal representations and stay on the true path of an activist virtue? Yeah, why not? That's the question. His answer at the end of this was he couldn't really imagine what cognition would be like without thinking of it in representationalist terms. But I have a longer story about why we shouldn't let that intuition drive too much of our framework here. And anyway, if you take that answer, you get out of hell card for free. So that's a good thing. This is the very last thing, Lauren. So I actually will just finish on this. Some consequences of this. So I'm really been attracted to work by Phil Gerrans in looking at the nature of delusions. And I've looked at the way narratives might play a role in therapy in a lot of different ways, but more recently here. And what I'm really taken by is he looks at a whole range of delusions, Capras, others, and he notices something in the feature of some of these delusions, which is that the way that the patients respond is that they seem to be wedded to a story, even though on one level they find that irresistible. We can explain why different delusions they find the particular story so attractive, But he says often they when confronted with whether they think this is rational or otherwise, they themselves will tell you, or at least in some cases, that they don't think it's so. It doesn't hold up to that kind of scrutiny, but nonetheless, it proves irresistible to them. And one of the things that comes out of his analysis is that there are really two very different ways of approaching this. We make sense in terms of narratives versus how we approach things in our scientific practices. And in fact, he leverages that difference to help us to think differently, to think that what's happening in the cases of these delusions doesn't go by means of a picture of standard ways of believing that are open to test and evidence in the usual ways. So the idea here is really putting to the centerpiece that the narratives really do something quite different for us than does our scientific styles of reasoning. And that plays a big part in his story. So, I mean, just to take very briefly a little exchange, the clinician asks, what if I told you I don't believe your story, what you're telling me about your delusion? And the subject answers, that's perfectly understandable. In fact, when I tell a story, I feel that I'm concocting a story. It's not quite right. Something's wrong. The longer exchange takes you through this. And a lot of, if you've read his book on the method of madness, you'll see that there's a lot of convincing cases where Gerens is saying, look, what we're finding here is people are aware that this doesn't stand up to kind of scrutiny if we put it to the test of making inferences about how things are. Nonetheless, they get committed to the particular stories. And sometimes they're even aware that they're concocting stories as such, right? That they're doing something quite different, even though it's difficult to say, there's a big debate about whether we should count those as having certain beliefs or not. My point just is, and I would just have had more time, we could do more examples, but we can talk about this, that seeing the differences between narrative-based thinking and scientific-based thinking may play a very important role in getting a better grip on certain tendencies of mind that are important to clinical work, and aligning it by trying to collapse what's going on in narrative-based thinking into scientific-based thinking has its risks then, because we will lose a grip on seeing that diversity. If we're going to understand the norms and forms of that kind of storytelling tendencies, requires, I think, looking at the surrounding narrative practices in the cultures. Like that, they differ. That's the important point. And to gain such an insight requires looking beyond the brain in particular, right? We don't want to go down into the brain and its inference-based, alleged inference-based activity to explain our narratives, features of our narrative practices. That, I think, is a dangerous path. Quoting from my old friend, Matthew Radcliffe, who, from a paper where he was disagreeing on other points, this is a point upon which we do agree. What we find when we turn to literary narratives is a rich, nuanced understanding that has not yielded to systematic analysis, has important features that we're still, exploring. And the very final slide would be this. I think that this approach, to use a motto that Wittgenstein thought about using for his philosophical investigations, but didn't, is instead of trying to collapse this into one unified theory that all has the shape of scientific theorizing, I want to say that the more liberating move is to look to the differences in these practices, and understanding those, I think, is going to be put us in a better position to understand the variety of cognition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you, Dan, for, as usual, a very provocative and stimulating talk, and given your self-assigned role of constantly clearing away the underbrush and the confusion. It's an honorable philosophical tradition, in the Wittgensteinian tradition. And it certainly serves as a great impetus for all of us to sort of clarify some of our own thinking, and really very happy that you've taken the time.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.